So this week, the week of March 23rd, Fox News did some hard-hitting reporting asking college-age spring breakers, the future of our great nation. Yes, apparently college-age spring breakers are the future of this great nation. About what issues facing the United States affects them the most. We got a self-destructive war of choice over the Strait of Hormuz with oil trading over $100 a barrel, with part of the federal government shut down over ICE funding, essentially with TSA being largely unfunded. Data centers and high transmission power lines are effing with your lives. The U.S. Department of Treasury has declared the U.S. government is not about to be, is technically insolvent, which we'll be talking about. So this is like, given all these fun things going on, this is what these kids on a beach in bathing suits have to say about it in a moment of utter zen.
What have you heard that Donald Trump has been doing recently?
Gulf of America. That's the last thing I kept up with.
We're going to war with Iraq. That's been crazy.
What do you do in Colombia? You got Maduro out?
I don't with Trump, but that done.
He's like trying to sue those people for making jokes about him.
600 times!
You must be happy.
I'm very happy.
The Ayatollah's dead.
What? Who? What? What is that?
Who the is Ayatollah?
I've never heard that word in my life.
Lewis, what's Ayatollah?
I haven't heard. I found out about Chuck Norris yesterday. That was more devastating to me.
Okay, that's enough of that. So that's cool. Hello and welcome to Colonial Outcast, the anti-imperialist podcast that unfortunately would make zero sense to any of the people just interviewed during their spring break. You may feel like spring break doesn't exist for you anymore due to wage slavery and because the world is on fire and isn't going to get better without rapid and radical action. And you may also feel like that your life would be easier and your happiness more assured if you were just a rich college idiot on a Florida beach with a trust fund. But you're not. And here we are with myself, Greg Stoker, and regular geopolitical analyst Alina Xenofontos coming to us from the sunny island of Cyprus. If you were to interview Cypriots about the problems they face, would they be as informed and articulate as the quote Americans that we just watched?
First of all, I gotta say, I thought that was a skit. I was like, "There's no way that was actually Fox News." I couldn't believe that. That just looked like one of those, like the American kind of comedies. Like I was thinking 22 Jump Street or something. That's just what it reminded me of. They had it.
Yeah.
They had one that was at spring break. Now Cypriots, I don't know what to tell you. I think probably their age and generation. I'm not gonna lie. I don't think they would be too different. But
No,
could be
really?
wrong. I don't really have that much faith in because I mean these are college kids, right? Because you said it's like on spring break. I don't know. I mean, maybe not to that extent because they're somewhat more involved. You know what I mean? Because it's in the region and there's such a massive scare here. So like there's a certain degree they are somewhat more aware. But I don't know, man. I don't have too much faith. I apologize in advance. That offends my people.
Okay,
Just
well,
gonna say what it is.
I don't think you could be worse than U.S. citizens, though, in terms of being
Okay, as I said,
uninformed
probably
and
not worse.
as
Probably not
unworldly.
worse. No, I don't think they're worse, but I just feel sometimes, I don't know. I don't have that much faith in some of the college kids that we have university students, to be honest with you, too much. But I could be wrong. I could be wrong. That's what I'm saying. I could be wrong. It really depends, I guess, on what kind of group of people you're talking to. So I think it could go either way. I think there are those that are really informed, depending on like what their areas of interest are, and there
Yeah.
are others that are just completely like, yeah, I mean, this is going on, but they're somewhat aware, but don't really care too much.
Yeah, and to be fair, like we've both done speaking events on college campuses before where kids are like really, really involved politically and
Mm.
absolutely further ahead than I was at that age. But like, this is just such a large demographic, and they're definitely not going to be like the vanguard element for a socialist revolution anytime soon. But just be aware that some people are as stressed out and as horrible as you think everything is. There are people who have no idea about any of it. So yeah,
Must be good though to live in their world a little bit.
I know.
I don't
I'm
know. I
kind of
think
jealous. I'm jealous. Before we get into all the bad stuff in this episode, I can talk a lot of smack, but it seems nice.
it does. No, it absolutely does. We spent. So, I mean, I think every other night you and I having like a bit of a mental health breakdown through through the chat section, like, oh shit, this is happening, that's happening. I mean, it would just be nice. I don't know. I would go by the beach, have a coffee, not have no clue what's going on. Yeah, sounds stress free. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, what I've been doing is I've been implementing gardening into listening to the news. So it's kind of
Oh
like
yes.
a balance a little
I
bit.
have to say, you guys, Greg has shown up to be quite a talent. I've seen the footage. Pretty great stuff that's going on in your garden. So, all the hidden talents that Greg has behind the scenes.
Yeah. Well, got to keep busy. So that's what we're doing here by talking about geopolitics. Guys, real quick, before we dive in, this channel is incredibly suppressed on YouTube. So just know that we are on all audio streaming platforms. And if you listen to Apple Podcasts specifically, please leave a review or just go over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review so we can get pushed further up the recommendation list in news and political podcasts. Okay. Plug over with. So, in short, the war against Iran is not going well, which is such a shocker since air campaigns don't win wars, as we've been saying on this podcast for years now. As you might have noticed, Hezbollah is still very much intact and is ripping through Israeli Merkava tanks south of the Litani River as we speak. And the United States, much to the delight of the Israelis, has been sleepily and ponderously walking straight into the age-old escalation trap. Increasingly, it now seems like the only way to accomplish our mission is now primarily to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which I will remind y'all was open prior to the war starting in the first place. And the solution is to put boots on the ground. When I say solution, I mean it in the most sarcastic way possible. So that's a new assessment from the Wall Street Journal. We're seeing a lot of indications that we're headed in that direction. Again, this clearly was not the plan. If this was the plan, we would have had all these assets staged in theater before we kicked this whole thing off, just as a contingency. This wasn't even a contingency plan when the operation started. So everything is being put in place for a half-cocked ground operation. And this follows retired General James Mattis's statement just yesterday, who was a former defense secretary under President Trump in his first term, and the guy who covered up the Haditha massacre in Iraq. He said, quote, "We're in a tough spot, ladies and gentlemen, and there's not a lot of good options." And I can't identify a lot of options personally on how we, from the imperial perspective, can get out of this mess. As of right now, there's no way to spin a victorious narrative for de-escalation, which is actually imperative for the continuation of the U.S. empire. So Wall Street Journal, generally a hawkish organization that has long since declaimed against the threat posed by the Iranian regime, they said today, quote, "The Trump administration finds itself in a larger war than it expected, facing a profoundly hard decision. President Trump must put boots on the ground to open the Strait of Hormuz and demonstrate the unquestionable supremacy of American power. If he fails, his legacy will be one of American collapse." Wow. I absolutely, for the first time, kind of agree with the Wall Street Journal. Continuing, if he succeeds, he will have prepared the United States for an intense period of competition over the next decade. Well, I don't agree with that last part. They say the only way to accomplish our objectives with a reasonable chance of success, those objectives now just being not the ballistic program, not the nuclear program, not the Navy, the Air Force, just reopening the Strait of Hormuz, that's now our objective, with any sort of reasonable chance of success, is to put boots on the ground. And we're hearing more and more calls for a number of different organizations and politicians talking about how we need to have troops there. So apparently this will not be solved until we put the 82nd Airborne and Marines that are set to arrive in theater on Friday. Yes, Friday, this weekend, on a bunch of islands or inside of Iran itself in order to secure the strait. So low intensity forever war it is then. That's what we're kind of looking at. However, the Wall Street Journal did not discuss this little hiccup as the Department of War seeks approval for another $200 billion war funding package. The hiccup being the U.S. Treasury has just declared that the U.S. government to be technically insolvent, and nobody is reporting on it. And did I pull up the article? Yeah, here we go. So just in case you guys aren't tracking, the Treasury, and this was from yesterday, the Treasury just declared the U.S. is insolvent. The media missed it. All right, so basically the government is insolvent. We're going to talk about what that means practically here in a second, and that's not hyperbole. It's the conclusion drawn directly from the Treasury Department's own consolidated financial statements for fiscal year 2025, released last week to near total media silence. The numbers are about 6 trillion in total assets against 47 trillion in total liabilities. So that's 6 trillion against 47 trillion in total liabilities as of September 30th, 2025. Importantly, the 47 trillion in reported liabilities does not include the unfunded obligations of social insurance programs like Social Security, Medicare. Those are disclosed separately in the off-balance sheet statement of social stuff. Okay, look, I don't want to spend too much on like the financial stuff. There's a lot of numbers. I'm not the financial person. Alina is. So instead of just like going off and just like reading this article verbatim. So when we say that the government is insolvent, just to be clear, that doesn't mean everything is collapsing right now or anytime soon. Let's talk about this practically. Like in the most practical layman's terms, what does it really mean?
Well, I mean, it basically means that we're at a stage where the United States can no longer continue to fund its imperialism abroad and also meet the demands of its own citizens and to run its own country effectively. So, when you look at the numbers, what was actually essentially presented there is that, okay, so the United States has a total assets at 6 trillion, and he said that total liabilities are, what was it, like 48 billion? Was
47
it 48 trillion?
almost 48 trillion.
Or almost 48 trillion. Right, so 6 trillion in assets, 48 trillion in liabilities, and then when you start to include all the social security aspects behind it, all the unfunded, supposedly, the so-called unfunded gap, then it brings it up to 136 trillion. This is how much the government has to essentially spend in order to be able to meet the needs of the country, while simultaneously also its debt, its imperialist ambitions abroad, and it just basically does not have the capacity to do that. Now, to put it into perspective, it's not the first time that the United States, historically, we have seen, it's not the first time we've ever seen the balance sheet essentially where the liabilities far exceed what the assets that the United States government has. However, it is the first time that they're actually including the Social Security aspect behind it, and the reason that they're doing that and they're placing it within the liabilities is because now we've reached a particular point where the Social Security, I guess, discrepancies are so severe that it is now understood that there's no way that the United States will be able to actually meet those needs. And in fact, when we're talking about, giving some sort of timeline, in the reports, if you actually sit down and look at the budgetary report, it's understood that even things like, the pension funds are going to run out by the early 2030s. We're now in 2026. Therefore, meaning that within the next 4 to 5 years, the 75-year kind of scheme that that is kind of laid out when they're assessing the sort of social security funds is going to basically completely run out. And this has been historically happening. It's been happening for decades. However, every time there was a discrepancy between the liabilities that the United States had and obviously the assets that it had, they excluded the social security aspect behind it, things like Medicare, et cetera, because the idea was, well, there's that 75-year kind of period by which we can be able to, the economy will sort itself out by then. But now that 75-year period is coming to we're coming closer to that 75 period kind of end, and there's basically no money. There's no money coming in. And what we're seeing in the United States at this point, and obviously I can expand on it a little better as we go on, like it's just kind of a quick synopsis, is we're seeing the contradiction between, I guess, the accumulation aspect, the accumulation and like the legitimacy behind the state. And what I mean by that is the accumulation aspect is all the funds and the debt, the money that the United States needs in order to militarize the world, to maintain the dollar as the world's global reserve currency, and at the same time, its institutions, meaning all these programs, I guess some sort of welfare programs that it has in place in order to meet the needs of its people, in order to placate any sort of, I guess, class conscious development, it's no longer working. So we're seeing this irreconciliation between its means of accumulating wealth, financial capital, and I guess it's welfare programs, if you like to call it as such, it's welfare programs that allow to, that legitimized the capitalist system inside the United States. So all these boomers, essentially, like, because this is what we're talking about here, who were promised decades ago that their work, all the money that they've been basically paying into the government, is then going to be returned to them in the form, because these are essentially IOUs. They have always been liabilities, even though they have been excluded from the assessment whenever there's a budget, whenever the state does its budget. Now they're essentially being told that in the next 4 to 5 years, there isn't going to be anything to give to this, to this generational group that has essentially been working over the last 40 years. They're not going to basically be able to receive anything back. And so this creates a very big problem for the United States, and what it means for the United States in terms of, I mean, if it goes insolvent, what does this mean for the dollar? It loses its reliability. And as it loses its reliability, people are going to try and basically diverge away from the dollar. But then as they diverge away from the dollar, this is going to cause a global economic crisis. That's the first thing, because you have all these international actors and who are investing in American capital, including countries like Japan, who are great, who have a massive amount of investment in American debt. But in addition to that, as countries are going to start moving away from the dollar, you're going to have massive amounts of inflation that's going to take place. And so what we're going to start seeing is essentially the unraveling of the United States at a gradual pace. But from my estimates, it's looking from between the next 5 to 10 years. Because if you look at this is essentially what's been presented. There's no way to meet. I mean, I think actually for Medicare alone, they're looking at funds running out by 2028. So that's in the next 2 years. And actually, the balance sheet found that between 2024 and 2025, there was a jump of 10 trillion to liabilities. That is an enormous amount in the space of a year. And based on what's currently, going on around the world, the kind of geopolitical events that are currently transpiring, this is only going to grow. So this actually is going to then, accelerate the economic contradictions inside the United States, which is essentially what we've been talking about. I think quite consistently throughout the program, that these internal contradictions of the US financial capitalist economy and its need to sustain imperialism abroad is no longer going to be, it's unsustainable, because it's going to cause a collapse within the United States itself. And the only way to try to, I guess, absolve that is essentially to, cut back on things like Medicare, social welfare programs, and then inflation. Quantitative easing, which is going to cause inflation. That's another way to try to deal with it. Basically pumping a lot of money into the economy. However, that's not really going to do anything in terms of purchasing power. And you're going to create that kind of inflation that, again, reduces the idea that the dollar, is a viable, safe currency, because that has always been the narrative that has sustained the dollar as a global reserve currency, that it is a reliable asset to invest in. And if this is based on what we're currently seeing, that's no longer going to be the case. So we're going to see an acceleration of countries that are going to try to move away and take their funds away from American capital assets. And this is going to have a domino effect. Like, this is kind of a bit of a synopsis, I guess, and you can ask questions if we can expand. Or not.
I guess from my own selfish perspective, if I was going to act like a boomer about it, I paid into Social Security through my taxes for 18 years. I'm not going to, by the time, if I make it to 65 or whatever the retirement age is for Social Security, that's I'd imagine that's not going to be a thing anymore, just to put it lightly.
Oh no, definitely, probably not going to be a thing anymore. And that's the thing. You have this a booming. I mean, this is why they're called boomers. We have this a growing, quite expansive population, an aging population that is now basically coming into their retirement age, and I guess I guess the younger populations that are actively working, the actively working workforce is actually significantly reduced, which actually makes the work of the states in terms of gathering those funds even more difficult. And the reason that's the case is because of the impacts that imperialism and deindustrialization population has had on the United States itself. So how are they supposed to accumulate the funds in order to sustain the kind of programs that as I said, up until this point, have acted as a means by which to placate the American masses and the working class from revolting? Because the idea is, we're taking your money, you're working hard now, but we're going to be able to provide you all these, social programs, or, your pension later on in life. That's now gone away. This is going to agitate the American population, and this is how class consciousness develops.
Yes, and this is exactly why I've been saying this for, I guess it's like going on 3 years now. Like, the U.S. government really doesn't have much to offer you in terms of your tax money going to you. And this is how I explain it to the lay people. You're not going to see any like social programs, universal health care. They're eventually going to privatize veterans benefits. All this stuff is going away. And there's a massive battle in Congress right now about DHS and ICE funding, because the militarization of the police going forward, if you can't, recognize trends, is the climate displacement plan. It's the housing crisis plan. It's the student debt plan. It's the plan for healthcare. When you don't have anything and everything's collapsing, the state needs to be able to control. And this is kind of like where AI comes in with predictive policing models, because in any sort of like class consciousness revolution, there's never enough police and there's never enough soldiers. So if you can use AI to give yourself the more of a ground presence, you're going to do it. And this is the expansion of the national security state as well. A lot of these guys aren't stupid. You can say like Trump and Steve Witkoff are kind of like idiots, running, foreign policy and stuff. But, a lot of the guys behind the scenes are not. They know an end is coming. America is being run kind of like a business, obviously. And that business is called asset stripping. It kind of reminds me of that protocol. And so, yeah, there's really not going to be much to offer you except using a fear event, immigrants, terrorism, to get you to buy into the national security state, because all this ride is going to have to come to an end, because there's no political will to change any of it. There's really not even significant legislation in Congress to deal with this problem of government insolvency.
No, there isn't. I mean, but this is the problem, right? When the United States is primarily, organized in a way that it's meant to meet the needs of, or rather profit-driven incentives of the largest multinational corporations and the political class that represent those interests, with many of them, being, when you look at the issue of the revolving doors, having worked with a lot of these multinational corporations, have been CEOs, or have themselves investment and are shareholders in these organizations. The situation is as such: if you're going to maintain the value and the wealth that you have currently accumulated, you need to consistently be able to, I guess, maintain the economic discrepancies that we see around the world. And to do that, this is how imperialism works. To do that, you need to basically destroy all, I guess, this is how war comes in. You destroy excess capital, overproduction. You try to deplete competitors, and that way you're able to continue that mass exploitation. But all of that funding to be able to mobilize these movements around the world in order to sustain imperialism, it's coming out of the taxpayers' money. It's coming out of the money. This is what's basically going outward. And up until this stage, money was coming back into the United States, in order as investments, and that's what kept the economy flowing when we're talking about that deficit that the United States is in. But at this particular point, the United States doesn't have any, like, the assets that are even in the United States at present are nowhere near enough at this stage to continue to be able to do so. The only way for the United States to be able to essentially save itself would be to stop their imperialist ambitions abroad, stop the war in Iran.
Well, we can't do that, because if we back down right now at this moment, that's pretty much the end of the U.S. empire. It'll start being the long, slow death of the post-World War II British Empire. Like, because like once I don't know, because like once they lost India, like that was the beginning of the end. And like this kind of reminds me of someone who's like focused primarily in college on the history of the British Raj. In some ways, I'm not going to make a freaking scholastic argument about it, but this is like the one like linchpin what's happening right now, that if they kind of back down, it's going to discredit like a lot of our other colonial endeavors, and it'll break the myth of U.S. Military exceptionalism.
It's going to break the myth of U.S. military exceptionalism. It's going to allow Iran to continue as a sovereign state as it currently is. It's amplified relations between China and Iran, and Russia. And also the yuan, how the yuan is used in terms of commodity exchange, and what that means again for the dollar. Because this entire war, as we said on the previous episode with Iran, is fundamentally as well the consequence of the fact that the United States is trying to push back against these sort of parallel economic and financial structures that are being presented through China, through BRICS, through the BRI, and specifically, the idea of, I guess, commodities being traded and exchanged in something outside of the dollar. And as I said before, when you're looking, it's called the Triffin dilemma. You need the dollar to be in high demand throughout the globe in order to have that capital investment in the United States to keep the engine going. And Iran is at this stage threatening that, because Iran is one of the central, if not the most important corridors for the BRI, and also one of the most important strategic partners for China in terms of, new financial trade structures and paying for commodities in a currency outside of the dollar, because Russia and Iran together do accumulate quite a significant amount of natural resources, and they're both now trading in yuan. And we've seen now what's happened with Iran, who's requested, if you're going to cross the Strait of Hormuz, even like, this is a new, you have to do it in yuan. This is actually going through the Iranian parliament now. There's a lot of conversation that can be had there with regards to like freedom of navigation, et cetera, that exists within international law. But then again, it's the sanctions regime is also a violation of international law. And to what extent they'll be able to impose that is questionable.
Yeah, and also too, something no one's really talking about is that through this war, Iran doesn't have formal sanctions relief in some ways, but in some ways they also have managed to get de facto sanctions relief. Like, for instance, the reality is that the war has provided Iran with this kind of de facto sanctions relief. Iran is exporting more oil now than before the war, and at twice the price. It has a lot of leverage, and it's probably not going to agree to end the war without formalizing actual ironclad sanctions relief right now too. So, oh, you're muted.
Sorry. They're actually making profits. And I think it was either the Wall Street Journal, I'm not sure, the Washington Post, anyway, one of these mainstream media outlets, they were actually reporting that based on insider information that they had and sources, always these unnamed sources, the Iran right now is actually making profits off of the oil, I guess, crisis. Is a manufactured crisis, obviously, that's currently taking place. And the whole idea, with the United States actually removing the sanctions lift for about over 150 million barrels, apparently, that were obviously at sea. The whole idea was apparently to flood the markets, et cetera, and try to ease I guess the pricing of oil. However, obviously we saw Iran's response to that. No, these barrels have essentially been sold out. This is not going to happen. But imagine if that had actually even been the case. That would have even given Iran the opportunity to sell their oil for like quadruple the price. So, like you said, this is actually being rather lucrative for Iran. And I mean, oil prices have skyrocketed to, I think, numbers even like higher than the 1973 oil crisis. And now with, the policy that they're trying to pass through parliament to get basically anybody who wants to go into pass through the Strait of Hormuz to pay essentially like a toll. When you think about how many I actually don't know the numbers, but hundreds, probably thousands of shipping go through the Strait of Hormuz every week. Imagine the amount of financial income that this is going to bring for Iran at a time after the war that they need to reconstruct and obviously be able to combat the sanctions. So effectively, they're finding a way to now sanction. It's like a reverse sanctioning of, I guess, countries that they perceive as unfriendly states. And I also do think it's important to say, technically the Strait of Hormuz, and they do say this and it's accurate, it's not technically closed. It's just been warded off against countries that are unfriendly to Iran. So that's mostly, again, NATO states, the EU, the United States, Israel, etc. But you've got countries like China, etc. They're still using the Strait of Hormuz. So I mean, it's not technically closed. So the narrative that the West is presenting is also somewhat inaccurate. If they want to work with Iran, they should negotiate with Iran. They should respect the demands that Iran has, and they can go through the Strait of Hormuz. But obviously, that is not something that the United States or the West wants to do. So they're presenting this narrative as though the Strait of Hormuz has been closed in order to prepare the ground for the military buildup that they have in mind.
I mean, there's a lot of BS coming out of the Trump administration. Of course, that the Strait of Hormuz is closed. No, it's just closed to like the U.S. and NATO allies and people hostile to Iran. That's important to note because it's actually kind of less embarrassing to say that it's completely closed and not just closed to us, and we can't do anything to reopen it. The other lie is that we're currently in direct negotiations with Iran, which Trump said, which the Iranian government has denied. Actually, it's being done through third parties, as it always has been. Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, the old roster who maintains Iranian relationships and acts as middlemen. So I guess like what we could imagine would be like the direct talks that the Trump administration is supposed to be having is like, these are our demands. And then the Iranians sent in their demands, and like that's it. A lot of them are going to be like non-starters for each person. Iran has a vested interest in keeping this going. There is a concern that they like might overplay their hand in some ways, which we could talk about. But there's really an intractable problem from the U.S. And so what we're seeing is Trump basically saying a bunch of crazy stuff over the weekend and then pulling it back when the markets open, trying to get all the way to next weekend when the markets close and just keep kicking this can down the road. So, over the weekend, he said, one of the reasons we pushed this episode to Tuesday was because Saturday he gave Iran the ultimatum, like, either you end this essentially, or we're going to hit all civilian infrastructure, desalination plants, etc. And then he pulled back Sunday night and said, actually, a lot of progress has been made. And now we're going to wait 5 days, 5 business days in order to just like, preserve this. And I think Alina can speak to this better than I am. A lot of people are making money off of this market manipulation.
Yeah, so this is what sometimes people don't necessarily always understand when they're not sort of familiar with how the markets work. Market instability generates a lot of wealth, especially for the largest corporations, whether it's defense companies, especially the oil companies at the moment. Because what happens is that whenever whenever instability is injected into the market, and so even when there's a drop in the values of shares of a company, this is always reported in mainstream media. Is, I don't know, 3 trillion lost in I don't know, sorry, 3 billion lost in the market today, or they always provide these sensationalist headlines that obviously scare people. However, the reality is what essentially happens in these situations is that when their share value falls, a lot of the largest multinational corporations across the board, whether it's tech companies, like I said, defense companies, oil, the big oil, it doesn't matter. All of these companies will basically use their excess cash reserves, because again, these are some of the largest companies, multinationals in the world. They have excess cash reserves, something that the average small to medium, size businesses do not have. They're going to use those excess reserves in order to essentially come in, swoop in, and engage in what we call stock buybacks. And stock buybacks are very lucrative because what that essentially does is that it artificially increases the value of those shares significantly, which basically generates enormous profits for the existing shareholders of those companies. And another thing that does is that not only does it increase the value per share for the companies, but it also is a very lucrative means by which to evade taxation. Because then, when you rebuy stock buybacks, and when you're rebuying shares, or when you've just recently purchased shares, you don't have to basically pay tax on those shares anymore. You only pay tax on capital gains at the moment you sell them. So those existing shareholders now no longer have to pay their annual tax on their existing shares. So there's all these mechanisms by which billions are made off of stock buybacks, which is why actually until the 1980s, I think late 1980s, stock buybacks were illegal because they were considered to be a form of market manipulation. It was a scam for the largest corporations to be able to accumulate money very quickly, and not basically use those funds in a more constructive way, which is obviously investment into their industries, research and development, employment. It's a quick way to make money. And it also, what does it do? It helps preserve the stock market. Where I guess you have in a time of crisis, or when competition arises and your share value begins to disintegrate, these crisis situations that are injected right now into the stock market devalues shares. And the moment that those shares are devalued, and they're repurchased, they could triple in size, therefore upkeeping that stock market, artificially presenting to the world that the American stock market is still strong, and that the value of these companies, whether it's Nvidia, whether it's, big oil, ExxonMobil, etc., they're still of high value, and that means that it will still attract foreign investors into American capital, helping preserve, like I said before, the American financial system, which, as we can see anyway, based on the insolvency crisis that they're currently facing, isn't really working anymore. But these are their mechanisms, and that's why Trump keeps playing this game. And I just want to say, we all remember what he did last year with the tariffs. Wasn't it every Liberation Day tariffs? 1 minute he's tariffing 90% here, then he's like, okay, I'll bring you down to 10. Actually, I'm going to tariff Mexico 50%. And he kept changing this every week. And the level of market instability was enormous. And actually, a lot of, especially like the big tech companies, the Magnificent Seven, made huge gains out of that. And like I said, whenever capitalism is facing its its crisis as a consequences of contradictions, these sort of market crises help these corporations to basically keep afloat and to maximize their growth. In 2008, the vast majority of Wall Street made, like the largest corporations in Wall Street, like JP Morgan, etc., had a market capitalization growth of 600%, meaning that their value of their companies grew by 600% as a consequence of crisis. This is how the system works, right? This is how whenever there's a crisis as a result of the fact that the American financial capitalist system it's not sustainable, a crisis is created that allows for them to be able to artificially present themselves as being I guess reliable forms of investment and sustaining that, I guess,
And all these
fictitious
guys
capital.
are getting heads up before it happens. Like Jamie
Oh, yeah.
Dimon, you mentioned JP Morgan has made a killing since the onset of this administration. His
Oh, yeah.
his
They're providing
his kid,
guidebooks.
yeah, Mark Wayne Mullen looks like he got insider information before he got nominated for ICE, about to invest in defense companies, like at the exact right time. So it's kind of like, are you going to be the next, Kristi Noem and have utter loyalty to the Trump administration because you just got some insider information and made millions and millions and millions of dollars? I mean, you can only suspect, because this has been, I don't know. Like, I was just a kid during the Bush administration, but like this has to be the most corrupt I've ever seen the US government, especially with like manufacturing like arson events and instability throughout the globe.
Do you know what it is? I also wanted to say, I don't know if you know, but Morgan Stanley was really like, they have a little guidebook on their webpage of like, this is a great time to invest in big oil and defense and aerospace. I know you have a good love for Morgan Stanley, so I wanted to put it out there. So basically, what I was going to say is, you know what? I don't even necessarily think it's that it's more corrupted than previous administrations. It's just that now the contradictions within the American financial capitalist system are so severe that it's desperation, that it's leading down, that it's, I guess, dictating the actions of the current administration. Because at the end of the day, the state isn't a neutral actor, right? It's representing the interests of all these corporations behind it. So whatever Trump is doing, he's doing as a matter of protecting the interests of all these the ultra wealthy in the United States. And like we said earlier on, it's reached that particular point of crisis now in the United States that they don't have a choice. That's why they're so desperate. Like, it's a first. That's why I mentioned before, it's a first that even the balance sheets now for the United States, it's the first time they actually have included Social Security and Medicare, etc., as liabilities. That has never been done before, because up until this point, it was merely a footnote excluded from what the U.S. liabilities were, because it was understood that, oh, it's okay, even though those numbers were growing on the side, even though we're basically burning through the money that is technically supposed to be funding our aging generation, that's fine, because we're going to deal with that when the time comes. That was the narrative that was being sold to justify why that was purposefully excluded. but it was actually a means to camouflage the reality that this was an impending crisis that was going to happen. And this is what capitalism does. It's always going to do these temporary fixes until it can't anymore. And right now, those contradictions are proving to be completely irreconcilable, and there's no way to temporarily fix it. This is the big problem the United States has. It's using its old playbook, but and it's amplifying it by 100, but nothing's going to work. Like this is the reality of the I guess the American empire, as you say.
Yeah, I know we often speak about like contradictions and the heightening of those contradictions. Just we got like a bunch of new followers recently. Could you just really quick explain what you mean by contradictions, just on the most basic level?
Okay, on the most basic level. All right, so I like how you're looking at me and you're giving me the look. I was like,
I don't
okay.
know how to. Well, the reason I'm passing this off to you because I don't know how to make it simple.
Right. So, contradictions. It's sort of how, in order, right. I'm just trying to find the best way to explain it. So, in the United States, for example, we have the capitalist state. We have the capitalist running economy, and what will tend to happen within a capitalist economy, we know for a fact this is not just something that's exclusive to Marxist thought, which tends to be, what a lot of liberal economic theorists will say. It's not. Even going back as far as David Ricardo as well. So, liberal capitalists. The reality is that in a capitalist economy, competition will always cause the rate of profit to fall. And as this happens, it will create an overproduction crisis, meaning that basically demand cannot meet the accelerated production that occurs within a capitalist society, because production and innovation is purely driven by profit needs. And that will always surpass, and it will be more accelerated than the demands of a population. This is what essentially happened in the United States. It reached a particular level of development where it essentially was no longer going to be profitable. So in order to sustain itself, and in order for capitalism to sustain itself, it needs to expand outward. And so as the decolonization period was happening and there was economic discrepancies within the global economy, there was an attempt to essentially, I guess, move industries. We saw this. It was the industrialization that we're speaking about. They were moving to the global south gradually because there's cheaper labor, cheaper resources that allows them to maintain their profit margins at home. But as that happened, these are the contradictions we're talking about. You've deindustrialized your own economy, but as you've deindustrialized your own economy, you're now gradually seeing, you're strengthening the global south in certain ways. So, for example, one major supply chain or industrial base was China, and for years that dynamic worked. The United States was able to export its supply chains to China. China was able to provide cheap labor. But now what's happening? China has essentially become a self-sufficient, powerful industrial base that the United States relies on, and as it relies on it in order to, for its own survival, it now has a peer competitor. It's developed a peer competitor. And at the same time, it doesn't have the industrial base anymore to be able to compete with the United States, with China. So this is one example of a contradiction. So a contradiction is that the rules of economics of capital will coerce it to act in ways to prevent its own economic shortcomings by using counter tendencies. So, like I said, exporting, your industrial base abroad. That's one way of doing it. War, destruction. That's another way of correcting the issues, because when you have war and destruction, you destroy all the overproduction. So when we're talking right now about Europe being demilitarized, for example, because of the Russia-Ukraine war, that means that there's a higher demand for American military production, which wouldn't have been the case if that doesn't happen. So they create these situations by which to balance out their own crises. But eventually what that does is that it weakens them. And these are the contradictions that eventually leads to its own collapse. That's
I think,
a way.
Yeah, I think honestly, another way to kind of examine like contradictions inherent to our society would be to just like look at neoliberalism, not just economically, but like politically, because it advocates for like free markets, deregulation, deregulation, privatization, and like reduced government spending. But it also contains several inherent contradictions, because it's like, individual property rights, freedom, blah blah blah. The preeminence of the individual and stuff. And these paradoxes kind of often create gaps between like the theoretical promises of efficiency and freedom and its actual outcome of inequality and increased control. And this is kind of like what we're seeing too, not just with a financial collapse, but also like the consolidation of state power into like more of an authoritarian, honestly, capitalism collapses into fascism type thing. So like first, like one of the contradictions I'd say would be like the state paradox, right? You know, the small state versus strong intervention. So like neoliberalism promises a small state that keeps its hands off the economy to allow markets to function freely. And the contradiction is that in practice, neoliberalism requires like a really strong authoritarian state to create and maintain the markets, to protect corporate property rights, to suppress resistance to privatization. And so the state is not absent. It's like re-engineered to serve profit over people or capital over its citizens. So it results in like a corporatocracy, you know, where the state serves as an administrative agent for like large firms, increasing rather than decreasing state power. And another one is like competition versus monopoly. And I think this is what a lot of people care about is like individual liberty versus like coercion, you know, and like the neoliberal order promises higher individual freedom and greater choice through reduced regulation. But I guess the contradiction there would be it creates widespread insecurity and powerlessness, which a lot of people are feeling right now, where people are forced to adopt like intense self-improvement strategies, like, you know, being on the grind, hustle culture, you know, and take all the risks on themselves, you know, the pursuit of profit overrides human rights and social risks are privatized, you know. And so like you're forced as an individual to manage issues like healthcare and education on your own while all these corporations get like bailouts from the government. Like that's like when we're talking about contradictions, it's the promise in theory and the reality of what actually happens. Is that another way
I
of
think,
going about it?
I think I just came to me. I think the insolvency situation in the United States is the best way to put it. The United States, in order to preserve, like I said before, its ability to control the global economy, requires militarization. It requires like regime change. It requires an injection of money into the global economy, but also in all these operations abroad in order to be able to sustain their dollar dominance and therefore their own economic, the financialized economy. That happened because of the industrialization process. Process spoke about before. But you know, the contradiction is what? So as they're funding that, all their money's going outward, basically. Now you have a situation at home where all the whole social welfare programs that were established in order to create the idea that the economy works for the American people has now been essentially burnt out. And because they've depleted all their funds and they're funding their imperialism abroad, it's actually going to bring about the very collapse that they're trying to avoid. You see, that's the contradiction there. So this is what we mean. Whenever capitalism does, because it reaches a point, like capitalism served its purpose. This is the point. Like it served the purpose during the industrial period, but after a certain stage, if it doesn't socialize and change the way it operates, meaning to remove the profit-driven incentive, it will ultimately always collapse. And it will find those tendencies, meaning these little things that they do to try to preserve the inevitable. And that's worked over the years. But right now in the United States, it's no longer working.
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
basically it. That's the contradiction we're talking about.
Yeah, and so that kind of puts a nice bow tie on like why Iran is like really breaking the back of this old system, especially right now. And talking like I know we usually discuss titles after the episode, but I might go with like it's all a scam, U.S. government insolvency, something, and the unwinnable war against Iran. And it is kind of unwinnable. And the administration really doesn't understand why or seem to understand why. They're legitimately surprised. And this is coming from like leaks from inside the White House staff to like Axios and the Washington Post and stuff. Like it looks to me like the Trump administration or certain individuals in the Trump administration like mirror imaged Iranian leadership and the Iranian agenda. So it's kind of like projection when I'm talking about where you think the adversary is like you, thinks like you, values what you value, covets what you covet. So when Trump and Steve Witkoff are surprised that the Iranians haven't folded under bombing, assassination, perceived economic collapse, they fundamentally can't understand why they haven't caved yet. So now they're like, okay, the bombing didn't work. Now a limited ground operation that's really gonna throw them back in their boots. But like these two billionaires can't understand like dying for a country or a cause beyond themselves, and that's also why they view U.S. service members with contempt. He called U.S. veterans suckers and losers. It's also like a great weakness that these kind of class of people all have. It reminds me of Robert McNamara, the US Secretary of Defense from like 1961 to 1968, and a primary architect of the Vietnam War, when he famously admitted that the US failed in Vietnam largely because they did not understand the culture, history, and the people of the region. These are things that these guys don't care to learn, really, and this is why they're weak, and this is why the entire class of people will eventually be swept into the dustbin of history. But like when Robert McNamara said that they didn't understand the culture and stuff, that's not true. There are plenty of advisors who are like, hey, this is not going to work. Just like there are plenty of advisors now saying, hey, this is not going to work. We've been warning about this for a long time. And my concern is like when CENTCOM gets rolling, it's like impossible to stop. Like when you start these limited operations, because one of the problems is like what the Pentagon does and what U.S. Army war colleges across the country do is they war game all these different scenarios, and the conclusions of those war games go on a shelf. And I forget what the actual terminology is called for what these are, but they exist for literally everything. There are military war game contingencies from alien invasions to zombie apocalypse. I'm not joking about this. This is absolutely real. Like decades and decades of wargaming everything. So when you see them being like, okay, we're going to activate the 82nd Airborne and this Marine contingency operation, this MEU brigade, like they're literally just pulling stuff off a shelf that has been on there for a very long time. And when stuff starts getting pulled off the shelf and put into motion, it's just so hard to stop it. So I think we're at a point of no return where we're going to start with a limited operation with boots on the ground on a couple of strategic islands. There's going to be U.S. casualties from drone attacks and stuff like that. And then that's going to necessitate maybe doing an amphibious operation on the coastline to protect the assets on the islands. And then it just goes into a freaking mess. And like, this is kind of where I'm going. I don't like to make predictions anymore, but this is my main concern. And it's just not winnable. So, and
It's
also
not a winnable war. Yeah.
And also the forces arrayed are 5,000 Marines that you can put on the ground, and then 10,000 rapid deployment forces inside the U.S. that can deploy to Iran in a couple days. 82nd Airborne, 75th Ranger Regiment, Special Operations Unit, but it's only like 15,000 guys. That's nothing. That's nothing. So it's going to start small, and then if this keeps going on, it's just going to snowball into an absolute mess.
Actually, while you were speaking, I also just wanted to point out, I mean, the entire war against Iran, right? I mean, when we spoke about contradictions, is like we said, it's tried to prevent the de-dollarization. It's trying to prevent the rise of BRICS and the empowerment of China. Contradiction in doing so is actually accelerating that, especially with the decisions that Iran has taken, right? So this is just like, I just wanted to bring that up as another example. And with regards to what you said, I mean, they have the United States, the way I see it right now, because its economy is failing in the way that it is, it's trying, again, it's the idea of making quick money. When you have CEOs of a lot of these largest corporations, big oil, et cetera, which is now, I mean, big oil's making, I think I can't remember who had actually I think it was Goldman Sachs had reported that they believe big oil is going to make around 64 or 68 billion in profits as a result of the current oil crisis, right? So the CEOs of these corporations and who have major influence through their own lobbying and, like I said before, the revolving doors within the the American state. their the quarterly bonuses come from, meeting those shareholder, profit threshold demands. And so this is the other aspect here. It's all about making quick money, and this is right now the defense industry, the demand for weapons, aerospace industry, etc. It's making huge profits on things that they can't deliver. But again, it's that short-term gains. So that's why they're pushing through as much as they can. And then the other aspect is, like what you said, they're so desperate to prevent the inevitable that they're heading themselves into a situation that they can't win, and ultimately are actually going to accelerate the conditions by which it's actually, whereas the United States is going to become significantly weakened. They cannot accept allowing Iran to exist, because we also have to look at what Iran's demands are. Iran itself, it suits Iran at the moment to continue the war because they can see it's having, it's depleting the United States militarily, economically, it's politically undermining the United States. And Iran wants to guarantee that it will never be attacked again, that it wants to raise the cost of war so significantly that it will not be touched. So for Iran, pushing the war as far as possible and not going for a ceasefire right now is actually the smartest thing to do. And they said our demands are simple. We want the entire U.S. military apparatus within the region, all its bases gone. They actually want compensation for the damages caused. They want guarantees that there will never be another war again on Iran. And I think even statements with regards to Lebanon and Palestine, in terms of even if this is how far Iran has gone in its demands. These are quite significant because Iran tends to stand by what it states, and this actually speaks to the volume of the confidence that Iran has. And so right now, you have, if the U.S. walks away now, it's able to salvage what it can. Let's just say if Iran was to accept a deal, which Iran is refusing to accept a deal, they will try to salvage what it can and most likely try to antagonize again Iran at a future point. So this is the thing. The United States has a lot to lose by allowing Iran to dictate the terms. One, because yes, it will be perceived as, it would have lost its, military, I guess, bravado internationally, but also it would effectively cement BRICS as a growing institution, but also the whole alliance between Iran, China, and Russia, and what that means to the U.S. economically. So there's all these factors that have the U.S. now locked in a war that they can't win, not even in terms of PR. They're losing even the PR war with regards to Iran, I think, anyway. But I don't know if my perception here is wrong. But I don't think it's, even through Western media, the way it's being portrayed, this is a losing battle. But they're not doing as well, but I could be very wrong in my estimation here.
Look, I live amongst I live amongst my people.
Okay.
Minds change slowly around these parts. But
okay, well then I'll take that back.
Well, it's the age-old problem that we're talking about. A lot of people who are starting to question the Iran war are going down the pipeline that we on our channel that we do here don't like them going down, where they're putting it all on Israel.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Look, Israel has undue influence on the U.S. government. They're a strategic liability. That's why they have to have a lobby like AIPAC and J Street to forward their interests. But
statements,
of course, we've done so many episodes. We've done so many episodes on this, though.
I don't know. Of course, we have. But this is the thing. A lot of the statements made now, especially by Joe Kent, and the interviews with Tucker Carlson, these, he has a very big platform. This is really fueling the narrative, but that again is controlled opposition in a way. The intelligence apparatus behind the scenes wants to push that narrative because it distracts away from the United States, its problems, its economic realities, its material realities, and it basically, diverges people's attention away from things like looking at the insolvency situation that's currently going on.
Yeah, and
people aren't going to be looking at that.
It allows the U.S.'s image and its structural violence to be rehabilitated, to be like, oh, we don't usually do that. That was a mistake. And that's because Israel temporarily captured our government. So in 15 years, if Israel no longer has the same relationship with the United States or even collapses in on itself, and be like, okay, that was bad, but we can keep on doing what we were doing, just like we did before Israel even existed, just like we did in 1954 in Guatemala, the coup in Iran. of Muhammad Mossadegh, even before we had such an entrenched and formalized relationship with the state of Israel, even when it was closer to the British Empire than it was to the U.S. Empire. Like, so
Mhm.
structurally, it's just, I don't know. I'm frustrated because I try to argue this point, and it's just exhausting. And I think these CIA adjacent people like Tucker Carlson are being very effective of
Mhm.
whitewashing U.S. military exceptionalism and U.S. militancy across the globe. And like he'll get on and like do a really good interview in some ways with like Zandy Mitten Beddoes, like the horrifying editor in chief of The Economist, and they'll get up and say like, I don't believe in collective punishment. Like I believe in Western values. It's like, collective punishment is an Eastern thing. It's like, oh, god damn it, like what the fuck, man. So it's just a really really frustrating information environment.
No, I definitely empathize with that position. I express the same
Yeah,
level of frustrations.
and
Yeah.
when it comes to Western values, I'm pretty sure that, the 200,000 indigenous Mayans who were genocided on behalf of United Fruit probably felt that that was collective punishment. I don't know. I don't freaking know
The
at this
entire
point.
United States is a settler colony. I mean, in a way, the base of the United States is a settler colony that was unfortunately successful. There's a whole history of, I mean, throughout the Americas of slaughtering the indigenous populations, but mostly, Europeans across the board, aboard. So, like, I mean, again, it's these are kind of conversations that I think, they become very problematic. This is precisely why they're being propagated to the degree that they are, because it continues the whole. Actually, here we're in the West. If we exercise, I mean, it's the same thing when we're talking about discussions with regards to capitalism. It's not capitalism. It's crony capitalism. Capitalism, if exercise the way it's meant
I
to.
hate
I
that.
know.
I hate that Scott Galloway guy. He's like,
Yeah.
capitalism's the best system. He just it got corrupted by nepotism and bribes and blood. Yeah, you mean the natural endpoint of just unchecked capital? Like what are we talking about, dude? And I got so
Monopoly
frustrated
capitalism will
because
happen no matter what.
yeah,
That's just the chain of events. Like, that's just how it operates. I mean, they don't look at the economic conditions, like how we've gone to the particular point. And this is the thing, refusal to understand and to accept the way things operate and relabeling them as things creates a problem. That's why I also do have a bit of an issue when people keep referencing now the Epstein class. I think Epstein needs to be discussed, but then when we start focusing too much on the Epstein class, it starts to become personified. We're starting to individualize, and again, we're distracting from. Well, actually, it's part of a system.
those were the bad monarchs and the bad billionaires.
Mhm.
Those were it's just kind of opens the door to narratively frame it as an aberration. The Epstein class only existed because Israel was there to run a blackmail operation against the transnational, globalists or wherever people go with that, and it never would have happened or been so organized if, it wasn't for Israel. That's the implication, and that's where it goes. As if the ruling class, even pre-capitalism, hasn't been absolutely obsessed with power and taboo and transgression. Like, what, dude? Come on.
Yeah,
Ugh.
I know. This is the it does get very frustrating. I empathize with your position. Believe me, I have the same frustrations. It is a problem, and I had actually read somewhere before that they're doing. I think it was like a couple of days ago, talking about how these actors are controlled opposition, and the left is not doing enough. We're supposed to be the ones opposing, the files in a more constructive way, but we're being pushed out by these Israel orientated narratives, and it's working like clockwork,
I mean,
unfortunately.
it's
But
it's really being so effective because there aren't a lot of actual leftists, especially in the United States. So it's easier to like try to reach out to conservatives, and they're just getting completely sheepdogged by these guys right now.
It's as well, like when you're even discussing, I guess what happened in Gaza, what happened during the genocide, the chemical attacks, etc. Like, this is an Israeli thing, like because now obviously we're seeing that same things that are taking place. We're also seeing Israeli media basically talking about the complete occupation of all of south of Lebanon up to the Litani River. They've openly stated that the area needs to be ethnically cleansed, and they're actually destroying all infrastructure. They've destroying the Litani Bridge as well, and
I saw
like I said, they're
actual
using
videos of that.
if they're essentially using chemicals to destroy plantation to make it unlivable for the Lebanese there. And the discussion is, oh, this is Israel. I'm like, well, like we said in the previous episode, this has been conducted by like the U.S. and the British Empire, like British empires, let's just say. Historically, in the past, we've seen that done before, and we obviously spoke about Agent Orange as one classic example, but also during the Iran-Iraq War, how the United States did help Iraq chemically attack Iranians who are still suffering with the consequences of that today. So this is not new. This is not new. This is not exclusive to Israel, but the way it's being portrayed is like, no, we in the United States are far more civilized. We would never have engaged in behaviors like this, would actually have been tried and tested.
And you know what pissed me off about when Tucker said that in that interview about like Eastern versus Western stuff? It's like there's this idea that empires have always existed equally, and it's just like a natural product of like what happens when humans get together. But there have also been like different types of empires. Let's take
Mhm.
let's take the Golden Horde out of it and the cons. But like in the East or like Asia, like with the Mughal and the Persian empires, those were like empire, or like a lot of the Muslim caliphates, those were like empires of incorporation, right? Where everybody was like incorporated into the power structure. And the Greeks found it very bizarre because they were still like a very, ethnic, class-based, patriarchal, slave-based society,
Mhm.
um, who believed in democratic values for like one group of people. And
Mhm.
they framed the
That's why
Persian.
Greek history is so amplified in the West. I'm just going to put it like that. That's why it's so
Yeah,
glorified
yeah,
as opposed to Persian Empire, for example.
yeah. And so
Yeah.
these were more empire in the Mughal Empire. Before
Mhm.
the Brits took over India, there was no famines. Under the Mughals, or there was no engineered famines or like necessarily people cut out from it, because that they're more empires of inclusion as opposed to empires of extraction, which is what European empires have historically been. So when the British come, like replace the Mughals, famines happen all the time. The worst and last one being the Bengal famine during the Second World War, where 3 million Bengali people died to feed the war effort in Europe. And
Mhm.
Winston Churchill's famous quote at the time was, "Famine in Bengal? What? Then why isn't Gandhi dead yet?" So there, it's just so much of a more nuanced conversation, and I'm just like too exhausted to have it
I
now.
can feel your exhaustion from here, man. You're just like, I'm done. I'm ready to go to sleep and I have to
Yeah.
deal with this shit. I do empathize with you. I don't know what to tell you. I know I have the same conversations and the same struggles. But what can we do? I mean, I guess this is part of the information war, right?
Yeah.
This is what the intelligence community tends to do. They will always present narratives in a particular way to always distract the masses. And a lot of it boils down to like the way identity is being used as well historically in specific religious groups, and the way they try to frame arguments. It's very much controlled in that way for this reason. So it distracts people from getting to the class issues and to understanding that ultimately, end of the day, the state apparatus, the political class is there to represent the interests of the ruling class, and that we are in this consistent state of class war. This is what's happening, and what's happening right now in the United States, that those contradictions, those class antagonisms are being completely strained. And much like you actually very accurately pointed out, we're going to see that militarization of the establishment of police state in the United States, because as they're going to have to resolve the crisis that it's upcoming, essentially it's going to be hitting the people. It's going to be quantitative easing that's going to be detrimental to the dollar, and that's going to have a massive impact on the working class there. It's going to be, cutting back on social welfare. It's going to be unemployment. It's going to be all these factors. And when people are going to be aggravated, all these programs, these ICE programs, et cetera, all this militarization of the I guess the security networks in the United States are going to be used against its own people. And it's going to be framed as, well, oh, this is just because of Israel, as opposed to the class antagonisms that require this pacification
Yeah.
because of the interest of the elite.
Yeah, and the contradictions are heightening, as we like to say, as I brought up neoliberalism, you're supposed to have freedoms, but if those freedoms are incompatible with capital accumulation, you get this. This was Steve Bannon yesterday talking about how there are now ICE agents and Department of Homeland Security inside airports. And we're going to end on this other moment of Zen because it's exactly as I said it would be 3 years ago when ICE started getting more and more militant. They've always been militant, but getting even worse, that they were going to be used at polling stations.
Use what's happening with these ICE helping out at the airports. We can use this as a test run, as a test case to really perfect ICE's involvement in the 2026 midterm elections. And remember, they said they're not going to work the X-rays. It's too complicated. They're not trained for it, but they're trained to, wait for it, check IDs. That's why it's perfect training for the fall of 2026.
It is the most Nazi shit.
This is why it's such a brilliant, this is another 5D chess move for President Trump.
5D.
Let's get ICE into the airports to help out to the lines. They can't work the machines. You know what to do? Just walk them down. Hey, we're speed things too. Can we check your IDs? ICE is going to be there in the fall of 26, just like they're in the airports today. So from the war room, suck on that.
I love it here. I love it here.
I don't know. I don't know what to tell you, honestly. I'm glad that entertained you. I honestly worry for the well-being of the people of the United States. I don't know what to tell you, but the situation, it's gonna continue to escalate. It's gonna continue to escalate, and like I said, from 2024 to 2025, 10 trillion increase in liabilities. That's in a year. It's gonna probably be double, if not more, just this year alone. And I don't know how the consequences of this are going to be dire. The violence that this is going to breed within the U.S. Is going to be immense. And I just want to say that at the end of the day, capitalism is always and has always been a fascist, economic system. And the only reason that within, especially the Western world, we have had all these liberal institutions and legal rights, etc., these are artificial for the most part, and they were only put in place as necessary concessions to appease the masses at a time that they could. And the only reason they could is because they were exploiting the wealth in the global South. But now, like we said, it's reached a particular point where that's no longer possible. And so it's going to expose itself by destroying all these liberal institutions and the so-called liberal rights that it's advocated for through these, and they're going to justify it through, well, the movements that are going to start happening within the United States. Well, these are that's a terrorist. He's a terrorist. Antifa's a terrorist. Who, you name it. And what we're going to see is actually the bare-face reality of what capitalism is like, when it is no longer able to conceal itself by exploiting the global South. And it's just the way it's going to have to be. So I guess the American public should prepare itself.
Yeah, which is why we're gardening, which is why we're doing community stuff and community defense. And I would just like to remind everybody that's feeling real depressed about this, despite what Steve Bannon says, none of these dudes are playing 5D chess.
No. No, not at all. It's desperation. It's just desperation. They will not succeed. And honestly, in a way, we shouldn't be too afraid of the chaos, because within chaos, within every sort of, major war, it's the opportunity for change. And if you look at, the Russian Revolution occurred, during the First World War, towards the end of the First World War. Okay. Sometimes it's necessary in order to bring about the kind of revolutionary change that's needed. And I think in the U.S. it's going to happen pretty fast.
Yeah, I will be saying, I don't need the unchillness and the mass death of the Russian Civil War in my life, but hopefully we can be a little bit more chill about it. So
I mean, we'll can help. All I know is that apparently Social Security pension trust funds are about to run out in 2030. So I don't know how that's going to pan out for everybody in the United States. It's another 4 to 5 years. No, wait, it's 2026. Yeah, 4 to 5 years away from a pretty serious situation, and that's what the current estimate. So I don't know how it's going to be, but it's not going to be good. And
Ooh, 2030. It's going to be my midlife crisis year. 40 years old. So perfect timing for everything to collapse. You
Oh,
know,
that
I
just
won't
sounded
even I
depressing.
won't even have to buy a Porsche because Porsche might not even exist anymore. Okay, so
Oh,
anyway,
is that how you're planning your midlife crisis? Because it's from the Porsche. Okay, I didn't
Yeah.
realize you
All
had it
right.
planned out already.
All right, y'all. So you can follow Alina Xenofontos on her Substack for some articles that she just wrote. And we can link that in the comments. Thanks so much for staying to the end. I think this is a pretty good one for a Tuesday. So we will be back. We are continuing going back to our roots. Later this week, Tuesday, Thursday, we are going to be talking to a doctor of anthropology about why a lot of people who voted for Trump or identify as conservative just aren't really waking up surrounding what's happening with the Iran war. So should be interesting if you want to take a more anthropological bent to this kind of thing. So cheers, y'all, and we'll see you then.